Hello, and wherever you are in the world.
Good morning and welcome back to our guests and members on the final day of our first virtual conference. My name is Ed Hodson, once again, for those who are joining us today, and I'm the Vice Chair of the IOSH Railway Group. The full programme of our theme, Mind the Gaps, can be found on the website link and will be provided in the chat box. This morning's presentation will be delivered by Simon French, Chief Inspector of Rail Accidents at the RAIB, and is titled Reflection, Lessons Learned and Lessons to Learn in the Future, and Investigating the Accident Before It Happens. But if we could reflect back to yesterday's webinar, Nick Millington provided us with a comprehensive and very candid overview of Network Rail's response and its plans to reduce the risk of track workers being struck by a train. This was broadly in response to the improvement notices served on Network Rail by the ORR following the Margam tragedy. In the probing questions, Nick was asked if the timescales of 3 years to address the improvement notices was considered appropriate to the risk, particularly as another fatality had occurred since then. So probably not a question in the remit of Chief Inspector of Rail accidents, but given the timely release of the investigation report into Margam accidents, I'm sure many questions will follow, and Simon is pleased and open to any questions on any aspects of accident investigation and, of course, Margam. Simon joined the RAIB in 2004 and has been the Chief Inspector since 2015, and his rail career experience is very wide-ranging, including 6 years Head of Operations with the Channel Tunnel Safety Link, later to become HS1, 10 years in different safety projects, including the Channel Tunnel, Heathrow Express, and the Great Belt Tunnel in Denmark, as well as operational roles with Network Rail. As the Chief Inspector of Rail Accidents, Simon is responsible for the overall management of the branch, ensuring RAIB fulfills its primary aim of improving safety on Britain's railways, and he actually reports directly to the Secretary of State on these matters. Many of you will know that Simon frequently engages with stakeholders to promote safety learning and understanding of RAIB's work. And if you haven't attended one of his accident investigation workshops, I can highly recommend them to you. And Simon is also a chartered member of IOSH. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ed. And I'm really pleased to be able to join you here at this webinar. So, just to check, can you see me and hear me?
I certainly can.
Well, that's okay. So there's at least two of us in this conversation. That's great. All right, I'll just share my screen and let's kick off. All right.
That's it. Well done. We're there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And what I would like to talk about is the huge overlap between investigation, the art and science of good investigation, and wider risk management. And it's a theme I feel quite passionately about. I hope that will come through as I go through this presentation. And of course, I will be touching on Margam as we go. A few words about me. I've been in the industry since 1982. And I've had a wonderful time. I think this is the most incredible industry to be part of. I'm very proud to have had such an involvement over a period of time. That photograph, I use it too often, but I enjoy it. That's the test running of a Eurostar on CTRL, as was now High Speed 1, back in 2003. 330 kilometers per hour, which for a long time was the fastest a train had ever traveled in the UK. In English, that's about 189 miles per hour. So that's me. I won't talk too much about me, but if anyone remembers me from early in my career, then please, always happy to talk again to old friends. So where do you start when talking about accident investigation? I suppose at the beginning of this presentation, I feel much the way I did at my very first deployment to a real accident. And this is it, Cricklewood Curve, back in 2005. And yes, there is that feeling, my goodness, where do you start? And I feel much the same now, to be honest. Luckily, I've got some slides which are mainly there to give me a roadmap through this, to keep me more or less in line and to ensure that I can deliver my views in a reasonably cogent manner. So where to start? This is what I'd like to do. And I'm not going to spend long on the principles of evidence-based causal analysis, but it is the starting place. It's for RAIB, it's always the starting place. As investigators, we are dedicated to evidence. We work through causal links as far as they can be edited, as far as they can be evidenced. So I'd like to start very, very briefly by talking about that. Moving on to how we investigate deeper systemic factors as part of our investigations. Touching on Margam as a case study, as an illustration of how we've used our techniques, and then talking very specifically about this overlap between investigation, which is sometimes wrongly seen as a little specialist niche, and risk management in general. I hope at the end of this we can convince people that investigation is very much part of your risk management process. It's not an add-on, it's something you take out of the drawer when you've had an accident and you feel obliged to do it. Far from it. Investigation is part of risk management, and risk management is part of investigation. That's really the theme that I want to finish on. So, evidence-based causal analysis. We are dedicated to investigation. We believe our conclusions must be supported by solid evidence. Why is that? Because without evidence, our findings are just opinion. And we therefore believe very much in cause and effect and trying to understand cause and effect so far as you can. Yes, there are areas of uncertainty. There will always be areas of uncertainty, but that uncertainty is something that could be managed as part of a competent investigation. When I joined British Rail, in general, investigation or the outcome of investigation looked very much like this. So my lights just switched off because switched back on. It was very much linear. We've had a collision. Why? Because there was a SPAD. Driver made an error. Why did he make an error? If you were lucky in those days, you might just get down to the level of distraction, and that was seen as a pretty well complete explanation. Now, I'm being a little unfair. There were always enlightened people who wanted to dig further, but there was to some extent a very linear approach to accident investigation. There was one line that you needed to follow to understand why something went wrong. If you read our reports, you'll know that we are dedicated to going wider. Why did the driver make an error? Well, distraction may be part of it. There may be other factors that come into play. Fatigue, signal sighting, weather conditions. These are just generic types of things that we see in our investigations, not taken from any individual investigation. We, and I believe this is true of investigators right across the industry, look wider. And I think we're getting better at looking wider, looking for more factors that combined to create a precursor to the accident. So let's talk about going deeper. So having gone wider, so here we see, I mean, I've presented it as a fault tree, but you could just as well present this as axis map or some other methodology. I like fault trees. I'm a simple soul. It's a nice way to actually capture the factors that led through to a precursor that in turn led to an accident. Once you start to go deeper, you start working into what are often described as systemic factors or organizational factors. And these are factors that sometimes spread across a number of different legs of your causal analysis. And this is what I want to move on to now. This is about the next layer down, moving into systemic, organisation and cultural factors. So that's where I'm going next. We have thought over many years, and as we carry out investigations, we needed to develop a methodology that takes us through the consideration of organisational factors when we're carrying out investigations. Now, we're proportionate in the way we do this. You can't redesign the structure of an organisation every time you have a minor accident, but there is a case for the bigger accidents, or where there is new safety learning. There's often a case for digging further into the organisational structure and understanding how the structure and how that organisation functions, how those have contributed to the accident. And we do this in a three-step process. The first is by asking how the safety management system was supposed to manage this risk. After all, safety management system is there to manage risk in the simplest way of expressing it. So why did it fail to do so in this particular incident? So that is for us a first step. What was the defined process, and how did that process, or why did that process not function as intended, or what was missing from that process that could have managed the risk? Sometimes even that's not a full enough explanation. Underlying that, are there any organisational cultural issues that created these conditions that allowed the accident to happen? Cultural conditions, attitudes, the way we do things around here, all of these things. I'll talk more about culture as we go on, but all of those are worthy of consideration. And the third step is to recognise that no railway organisation is separate and distinct, a bubble on its own, but is actually part of a larger community. Other organisations that it interfaces with, so train operators interface with infrastructure managers, but also interface with neighbouring organisations and suppliers and contractors, and it goes on and on. So the wider picture, the wider community issues. And those wider issues are often feature in our investigation. For example, our recent investigation into the derailment or the collision with a landslip at Corby recognised all sorts of issues that had very little to do with the railway industry itself, but were more concerned with the management of watercourses and flood management and local authority planning rules. So wider organisations often feature in our investigations. Causal analysis can take you to that. AxiMap is in fact a particularly good tool for challenging, for checking, if you like, that you've covered the wider external factors that may have contributed to an accident. So let's start with the SMS. Everybody, I suspect everyone in this webinar understands the principles of a safety management system. If you don't, welcome. Here's an opportunity for a first introduction. From the point of view of an investigator, really want to break it down to the very essence of what a safety management system is, which is a collection of risk control measures there in the centre of the diagram. Management assurance processes to review and monitor the extent to which those risk control measures are effective, processes to learn from experience, process to risk assess, to understand your risks in order that you can review and, where necessary, update and improve control measures. And lastly, but by no means least, processes to manage change, because no organisation is static and change is a constant. So this is our starting model. This is where we start with when we think about safety management systems. Really, it captures the essence of a safety management system. Of course, there's a huge amount of detail, and RM3 provides all sorts of pointers to the sorts of things that should feature in a good safety management system. However, the essence is there captured in that slide, I believe. So a really simple conceptual model. So when we investigate how organisational factors contributed to an accident, we really go through these steps. We are considering, firstly, the control measures in their steady state. How effective were they? And if they were ineffective, why were they ineffective? Was it non-compliance? Was it lack of understanding? Was it lack of competence? Or was it that the risk control measures weren't in themselves sufficient to manage the risk? First step. Management of change features so often in our investigation. Probably half of our investigations, if not more, have an element of change management. It's not all about steady state systems. It is about the active management of change. Having understood those elements of an investigation, you always find yourself asking the question, the extent to which the organisation was aware of the risks that it needed to manage. So risk awareness. Did it understand the hazards? And did it have processes in place to assess those hazards? Did it really have an understanding of the risk to prioritise the risk in a structured way? And did that feature as a cause of the accident? Remember, we are not auditors. We're not here to check the safety management system in itself. We're here to see where any of these factors were relevant to the cause of the accident that we are investigating. That will always be our approach. We then move on to processes for learning from experience. This is investigation, reporting processes. Did the organisation learn from previous experience, and was that relevant to the accident? And last but by no means least, management assurance. Was the organisation self-aware? Did it know how well it was functioning in terms of its safety management processes? Safety culture, or organisational culture. Now, there are as many definitions of this as there are academics who have studied it. We settled on James Reason's very simple model of safety culture, and then adapted it to our purpose. But he talked about these 5 elements that will be found in a strong safety culture in an organisation that performs safety functions. He said organisations with a strong safety culture will be informed, will have a culture of reporting. Information flows through the organisation. Learning. You would expect organisations with a strong culture to want to learn and to be able to learn, and then to be able to adapt to that learning, hence the flexibility. And underpinning it, a just culture, a feeling that it is okay to challenge something that is unsafe, or it is okay to report a safety issue, even if that safety issue relates to an error that you yourself have made. So we started with, and we find that model works well for investigators. There are far more other models out there, more sophisticated models, but essentially it captures the essence of what we believe safety culture, strong safety culture looks like. And we use that as a starting place. So you have those elements. We've taken those elements and we've added to James Reason's model leadership, the extent to which leaders communicate their commitment to safety, but much more than that, the way in which they exercise some sort of authority and the way that responsibilities are allocated throughout the organisation. So, some of you have been to our previous good practice seminars, and Ed was kind enough to refer to these. We'll be aware of this, taken all of those headings there from those slides, and we've combined them in a simple conceptual model. It's not anything clever. What it is essentially is showing, it's essentially a checklist down the left-hand side of the sorts of things which investigators need to consider and how those can feed up through system to the failure and inadequacies in risk control measures. And we find this model has served us well and has been applied in a number of our investigations. And I'll come back to that a little later. I'm not going to dwell on it because I think it just reinforces the slides that came earlier. However, investigators like clarity, they like a place to start. And what we've done is to actually break down these these ideas into a number of questions, 8 simple questions, which provide a starting place for the investigation of systemic factors in any investigation. Firstly, what were the relevant control measures? What were the control measures in this particular case that should have controlled the risk in relation to the accident that we are investigating? Were they correctly documented? Were they understood across the organisation and applied? Now, what we often find in our investigation is these control measures were absent, or perhaps they were inadequate. Maybe they were missing entirely, or were not correctly applied. So this is a sort of starting place in so many of our investigations. And yes, we've provided guidance to our inspectors on the types of evidence that will enable you to answer that question, because this isn't about opinion, this is about evidence. This is about concrete evidence that demonstrates that this factor was in place and was relevant to the cause of the accident. The second, the extent to which hazards and the associated risks were understood by the organisation. The extent to which the risk associated with change was understood and effectively managed. Now, in some ways, this is one of the easiest things to investigate. The common safety method and present thinking on risk management in the rail industry is perhaps very focused, and I would argue over-focused, on change, on the management of change. So there is usually some documentation to show how change was meant to take place and the risks that people thought were introduced by that change and how those were to be mitigated. So things like project hazard logs, risk assessments, these sorts of things provide useful evidence when considering the way that change is being managed. Management assurance. What mechanisms were in place? Audits, management reviews that were in place in order to review, monitor and review the efficacy of the safety management systems. And what we sometimes find, and have found so many times, is organisations had not really recognised the extent to which their control measures they'd had in place, sometimes for many, many years, were deficient or had failed to detect that the control measures were not being correctly applied. And we find that so many, almost by definition, we find that. If an accident has occurred, it is almost self-evident that a control measure was missing or has failed to be correctly applied, in which case the next question is always, well, why is that the case? How did the organisation know enough to manage its risk? Or I should correctly say, did it know enough to manage its risks? Was the organisation competent to manage its risk? Did it have the right people to do so? And were those people's competence being managed? Did it have information that it needed, sometimes from outside sources? And what sort of professional links did it have in place? Corporate learning. How did the organisation learn from accidents, precursors of accidents? How did it process data? And having learnt, how did it use that experience to improve its safety arrangements? Reporting. The extent to which organisations encourage reporting, and more importantly, perhaps, the extent to which employees feel empowered to report safety issues, particularly those relating to their own mistakes. What you find in so many organisations' databases of reports provided is all sorts of information about unsafe conditions. You'll find trip hazards galore, plenty of trip hazards and poor lighting, poor messing facilities, all these things reported in almost all organisations very freely. When it comes to reports of errors made by the individuals themselves, far less, indicating that people feel it is bad to report your own errors, that there will be repercussions. And this links, of course, to this feeling that a culture within the organisation is unjust, that people will be blamed, even if they report genuine mistakes. And leadership, the quality of leadership. Was the quality of leadership, or were the values within that corporate entity a factor in the accident? Were leaders sufficiently focused on the management of safety, or did they contribute to an unsafe organisational culture, either directly in what they said and what they did, or perhaps indirectly in their attitudes, or in the areas in which they chose to focus on as opposed to others? Important area, can be difficult to evidence. You have to dig, you have to look for evidence, because following an accident, all the safety climate would change radically. And you really need to understand what were the feelings about leadership. How did people respond to their leaders before the accident, not after the accident? Very difficult to measure after the accident. So tools such as safety cultures can be used. Safety culture surveys can be used, but are sometimes problematic. So there's a methodology, and we applied this methodology to the accident at Margam. We published our report last week, as most of you will be aware. The tragic death of 2 track workers in South Wales on the 3rd of July 2019. The 2 track workers were part of a group of 3 who were working with a noisy machine, a nut runner, on a set of S&C on the main line. And they, for whatever reason, became distracted from the work task and were unaware of approaching train. The factors that led to this included a deficient planning process, confusing presentation of information in the planning documentation, and a gradual breakdown in site safety discipline, which led to informal working practices, which broke down. What we also found is that at the depot in question, working on lines that are open to traffic had become a matter of routine. And people moved quite freely from working on lines that are open to blockages and back again. And this routine, there was nothing unusual, there was nothing special about working on lines that were open to traffic, as is true and was true on so much of the network. There were issues about dynamics within the group, which led to the absence of challenge to the way that work was being done. And a non-compliant safety behaviours that have been prevalent at the depot had not been identified by the local and route management teams. So when we moved on to the deeper systemic issues, we already had a lot to go. There's quite a lot to talk about here, but we wanted to understand what underlay this. And we looked at Network Rail as a corporate entity. We moved beyond the local depot and the route and looked at Network Rail as an overall corporate entity. It was clear, and we knew before we even started, that Network Rail had stated its intention to improve track worker safety. There was no absence of an intention to do this. There were the best of intentions to improve track worker safety, but this had not led to significant and sustained improvement. They knew they needed to take further action, but this didn't lead to substantive actions prior to the accident at Margam. Now, the diagrams below show that over a period of time, in the time running up to the accident at Margam, there had been a high number of workforce, high safety, high potential incidents on the network, sending signals that something was awry, that the measures that had been put in place had not been effective. And we've seen a continued high level of unassisted red zone working, people working under lookouts on the network across the UK for a period of time, despite again, a stated intention to significantly reduce this in accordance with the hierarchy of protection. So we looked at this, we applied the methodology, and we found that the changes to the Network Rail's track worker safety standard 019, the changes that came in at version 9, had not been effectively implemented across the network. And this was being revealed by a number of audits, but hadn't led to the action, that hadn't triggered the action that was necessary to correct this. We believe that Network Rail had focused, and we're not against technology, but they had focused on technological solutions, on finding ways of using technology to protect workers out on the track. Yes, absolutely. This is an important element, but we felt they'd taken their eye off the ball when it came to addressing the human and organisational factors, the behaviours on site, leadership skills, these other elements, these softer elements, which will always be important. Even when new technology comes into place, new methods of protection of track workers, there will still be a need to train leaders, the next generation of leaders, and to promote the right sort of safety behaviours on site. Management assurance is featured in our investigation. We looked at the extent to which Network Rail safety management systems were effective in identifying the full extent of procedural non-compliances. Audits were spotting these. Audits were reporting this, but this wasn't feeding through the process into actions, into management action, urgent management action to take the risk, to address the risk in time. There was a dawning realization within Network Rail at the time of the accident that something needed to be done, that something was wrong with the changes that have been implemented at version 9, but this hadn't led to the action to put that right. So, just to draw some conclusions. To conclude, I will argue that investigation and risk management are two sides of the same coin. Organisations learn from experience in all sorts of ways. They investigate when things go wrong, but they also learn from information and data that's collected. They have formal management assurance processes such as audit, management review. They learn from others. This webinar is part of that. I would hope that organisations are getting some insight by learning from others in this way, listening to its customers and its stakeholders. And most importantly, on the left-hand side there, listening to its own people. I think in terms of process, approaches to learning from experience, there's three basic approaches. The first is by thinking and reflecting on how safety is routinely delivered most of the time, 99.9% of the time. Safety 2. I think most of us are familiar now with Safety 2. Some really good ideas in there. Yes, we do need, and inherent in the Safety 2 concept is you still need to understand why things go wrong, but you also need to understand why things normally go right and how you can encourage those things into the future. So well worth flagging up. Safety 2, we all need to think very carefully about the implications of that different way of looking at safety. But Safety 2 doesn't overcome the need for Safety 1. Safety 1 is still there big time. Understanding how often systems fail, using data, and the consequences should have happened. If you like, formal risk assessment, absolutely inherent in what we do, and of course a legal requirement. And by investigating accidents and other system failures. The three elements. So if we're learning from experience, what does good look like? Well, after the event, we're looking for rigorous evidence-based investigation with a degree of independence and impartiality, of course, high degree if you involve the RAIB, but it should be there in any investigation, even if it's commissioned from your own people. Identifying causal factors, inherent, you need to understand why something went wrong and evidence it, and then make recommendations to address it. Those recommendations need to be proportionate, realistic, and the learning needs to be well communicated. You can have the best learning in the world, but if it's poorly communicated, you go nowhere. Risk management processes, good risk management process has so much of the same. Rigorous and evidence-based, open-minded and honest, identifying hazards, assessing risk. You can see there, just by comparing the two, there isn't really much difference. You're looking for the same qualities when you're investigating your risks, understanding your risks, or if you're investigating. There's three things risk managers can learn from investigators, I believe. First of all is the systematic analysis of failure modes. I think you can do this before an accident has even occurred. You can ask yourself, not how did my system fail, but how could my system fail, using the same formal methodologies, the formal systematic approach. And I think we need to see more of that in the way that risk is assessed. Yes, high-level top-down data up there in, the top historical data is of value, but systematic analysis of failure modes is important. Seeking to understand how people really behave. Investigators talk to people, interview people, and I think you can do that as part of your risk management process. I think risk management needs to be formed by proper conversations with people on the ground in order to test your model against reality. Accident investigation allows you to see how your model compared with reality. You can do that before the accident. You should be doing that before the accident, getting out there to talking to people. I believe investigators as a breed, and there's many of us out there that do it full-time or part-time, doesn't matter, we're investigators. We can learn from good risk managers. Smart use of data from multiple sources, not just from one place, but from multiple sources, something that's becoming more prevalent in risk assessment. And a deeper understanding how safe outcomes are nearly always achieved. I think as investigators, we need to have an inherent understanding, not just of what went wrong, but why does it normally not go wrong? Why is there normally a safe outcome? And sometimes safety learning is about reinforcing the good practice, rather than just putting back one or two issues and deficiencies in the process. And a more holistic view of how to manage risk. So, my conclusions. The three approaches to learning from experience should never be seen as competing or contradictory, as in the past there have been, and we need to move on from that. They're part of the same enterprise. The systematic evidence-based approach used by investigators is of value to the understanding of risk. This is what I'm trying to demonstrate. And lastly, by integrating the investigation of incidents and accidents into a risk management system, it'll bring real benefits to investigators and risk managers alike. And I'll close there, and I'll very happily take any questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think hopefully you've answered many questions, but I'll just go to the participants to just have a look at some of the ones that we have got that have come through. I think it was John who asked about how much focus is on the certification documentation before we get down to the SMS, the actual documentation that was provided as part of the organisation's certification.
Yeah, absolutely. We often do that because in essence, if you like, the documentation that form the basis of certification or authorization, for example, in the case of Margam, the health and safety management system formed part of the authorization process. That documentation is of enormous value because what it's giving you is the model. This was the model which was proposed to manage risk and was in due course reviewed and accepted by the organisation or by regulators. So yes, it's a very useful source of information. We will often go there. So if we're looking at a new piece of technology that perhaps hasn't performed as designed, we'll be particularly interested in the certification and the approval process.
I've got a really interesting question from Michelle, and I can even answer this one myself, but I'll leave it to you. Has the RAAB investigation method model been published for others to use, learn from? And does your investigation workshop cover this? And when is the next one?
Yeah, we have used the investigation workshop, and we intend to run one. We didn't run one this year, but for obvious reasons. Having participated in this webinar, I suspect that we ought to relaunch one next year, and if it's virtual, it's virtual. I prefer it to be face-to-face. So yes, There will be a seminar next year. I can guarantee that. And yes, it will cover this. Now, have we published the methodology? No, not yet, although we have briefed it through workshops and seminars over a period of time, and I have briefed it to a number of stakeholders. But we're minded to do that, because what is rather good, as investigators, we can tell you the questions we ask in advance of an investigation. Hopefully you'll never see us on your doorstep, but at least you can see the way we approach it. And we believe that the way we approach the investigation of organisational factors can help you look very closely at the way you're managing risks today. So yeah, I think there's certainly a notion there that I think we're certainly minded to put something out there that helps others, because that's what we're here to do, to improve safety, and we see the dissemination of good practice as part of that.
If it's any help, Michelle, I can say that I have not plagiarised. In my investigations, I use exactly the format of RAIB, and I found it so helpful in investigation and conclusions. So I think it's the actual format of the report is a very good plan for investigation models, and it's very useful. I've got a question from Anthony. What about the use of AI to predict accidents, incidents, looking at company leading indicators? Yes,
I'm aware that I think there are academics out there looking at that, and maybe you're one of them. But there are people looking at the use of AI. Now, I'm not sure we're anywhere close to that. It does, but the idea of predicting accidents has been out there for some time. I must express a degree of skepticism. What I think you can do from data, from big data, from massive amounts of data, what I think you can do is to much better identify precursors and common themes, and then put in processes to manage those. And I think there's enormous potential in that. So tools such as data mining, which in a way is an AI tool, data mining, extracting more data from massive amounts of data and reports and databases, does provide real potential in the future to predict not a particular accident, because we'll never be able to predict an accident at a particular place at a particular time. No one's suggesting that, but predict the types of things that may lead to accident. And certainly leading and lagging data can help you to do that. So I'm really excited about that potential, but it's probably some way off. I'd love to see someone really grab this and develop a tool and get it out there. And I think there's hope that might happen.
I've got a really interesting question from Tim, and it's one that I sort of have an affinity with, because I do a lot of work outside rail as well. Has the RAIB compared notes on investigation structures and methodologies with the HSE? Well, before you answer that, I think the HSE could learn a lot from RAIB. But Simon, if you'll probably explain the different remit.
Yeah, our remit is different, or at least our emphasis is different. To be fair to HSE, the immediate answer to the question, have we compared? No, we haven't. But that's probably because we didn't see that as the first place to start. I mean, of course, the HSE's remit is different, as I think everyone understands. They're there to enforce the law. They do have an advisory role that's still there, of course, but when they investigate, they're very often looking at whether there has been a breach of health and safety law. So it means they tend to come at it from a different angle. So yeah, we, as no blame investigators, we've developed our own methodology. We haven't looked at HSE specifically, but we've looked at many other organisations and how investigations are done, not just in the UK, but across the world. And there are some commonalities, there's also some interesting differences, but I don't think we have really the time to go through them in detail.
I'd just like to add, because as I said, I come through both and dealing with HSE investigations, and the difference is quite clearly different. Also is that as a professional investigating branch, the standard and quality, I think, is much higher as well. And also the speed of investigations. Now, there may be, well, a lot more in HSE for them to investigate, but I can certainly guarantee that the speed and quality of investigations from RAIB for the rail industry are significantly higher, and go into the detail that's been mentioned in Simon's presentation. I've still got some more questions, Simon. It's very, very interesting. There is a tool I'm used studying through my MSc in safety investigations called SAFRAN that is very similar to the model of RAIB. Are you aware of that? SAFRAN?
Yes, and we've used SAFRAN. SAFRAN was developed by a colleague of ours who works for the European Rail Agency, Bart Aku. We know Bart very well. He worked with us on SAFRAN, and we have tested it. Yeah, SAFRAN is an interesting model. In fact, we do brief our inspectors on SAFRAN as an option. SAFRAN is essentially a model. I'll very quickly summarize it, but essentially asks the question, it's a very good question, is if something didn't function as intended, why didn't it function as intended? And who knew that it wasn't functioning as intended? It's a very methodical and rigorous approach of challenging why something was allowed to occur. And it does take you very quickly to organisational factors. It tends to take you to the same places most of the time, which is to management assurance. What did the organisation know about itself and the way its process is working? SAFRAN is worth looking at. We have applied it, and it's quite consistent with what we've presented here. We have looked at SAFRAN because particularly the management assurance element and the learning from experience element is very consistent with the SAFRAN methodology. So yeah, I like SAFRAN. We like Bart. He's a good guy.
I've got a couple of questions now relating to Margam. And again, I think it was what I mentioned at the beginning, whether it was within your remit. 3 years for an improvement notice, despite the amount of work that needed doing and the technological side of it, seemed to be a long time given the nature of the accident, the history, and the fact that another accident has occurred subsequently. Did you have any comments, or could you comment on that?
I won't comment on the 3 years at all, because it's not appropriate. But what I will say is that, and I've said this publicly and I'll say it now, I am convinced that Network Rail are absolutely determined and were determined to address this as quickly as possible. So they took actions very quickly after the accident. They're not sort of, I will quickly comment on the 3 years and say that 3 years is the timescale for completion. But of course, lots of the activities have already taken place and will take place over time. So it's not as though you wait for 3 years and then suddenly it happens. 3 years is the point by which it needs to have happened. And I as an investigator, we were aware as we investigated Margam that Network Rail very quickly set up a safety task force and very quickly started taking immediate actions. So it's not as though nothing happens for 3 years, and I think we all understand that. Network Rail seem determined to push on with this, and there's a lot going on out there. But you need to, well, I'm sure you did ask Nick Millington about that when he was here yesterday. And
the other one of my own comments really is, again, I was quite surprised at the depth and the justifiable criticism in some parts of the report, and particularly Appendix F with the audit report. And I think if I could draw this to the attention of our audience, that Appendix F shows Network Rail's own findings and precursors to the accident. And I think if any organisation looks at that, so they had what looked like a very effective audit system, very effective audit that identified all these precursors to the accident.
Could I comment? And because this is really, I touched on it in the presentation, but it really matters to me. People understand that very often when people consider management assurance, they ask the question, do we have an audit process? Yes, we have an audit process, tick in the box. Network Rail have an audit process. Their level 2 audits identified a lot of evidence. And the next question beyond your audit process, in some ways more interesting, is what are you doing with your audit findings? What difference do they make? What actions are being taken? And how are lots of audit findings over a period of time being combined in order to draw some general conclusions? So it's not, are you doing audits? That's important. That's just part of your management assurance process. Is how are you using this data? What are you doing with it?
I think that's what can cause a lot of embarrassment. It's quite a strange thing when you've got such an effective process that identifies them and nothing happens afterwards. That's when I think it becomes a bit embarrassing, I think, when you've got such a good process. And I've certainly worked with Network Rail in their audit system and with auditors and found it quite effective. I think we mentioned earlier about RM3 and the impact of RM3, and I can confirm that there is some developments. I'm on the RM3 governance board. There will be some developments coming out very shortly on the e-learning as well to implement RM3 even further than it is in the industry.
Ed, can I just, there's one comment that's come up on the Q&A. Someone asked the question, can the model restrict the investigation? Does it prohibit the curious nature? Very good question. And the answer is, if you like, there is a stamp across every model that we use, which is to say, this does not prevent the investigator from applying their own instinct, their own curiosity. The model is just a framework and you work around the framework, but no, we don't, it doesn't, if it ever constrains us, then that's a problem. And certainly my inspectors are not very trammeled by models. So they use this as a framework, but move off and into other directions. It's a really good question that's been asked by John Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I missed that. I think
it's just a good question.
Yeah, I was waiting further towards the end, but I think this is the most questions we've had on any of our webinars so far. So I'm just making sure we haven't missed any off. Going through both. I know you cannot, this is from Amanda, I know you cannot investigate every instance, but if you could, do you think it would make more of a difference?
No, I think it would be the wrong thing, because I believe that the value of investigation, and the message I'm trying to put out is don't see it as just a little module plugged into the side of your SMS. It should be central to it. And you should be investigating not just accidents and incidents, but precursors, things which are benign in outcome, but in different circumstances could lead to an accident. And I believe it's actually important for organisations to do this themselves. And therefore, I don't think I don't think it would be right or appropriate or necessary for RAIB to investigate all that. I would like, in the ideal world, I'd like us, in the ideal world, we wouldn't need to investigate any accidents. But I think there'll always be a need for independent challenge, and that's why we exist. But I do believe the bulk of investigation needs to take place and is best to take place within organisations. So the reason we run the workshops, as Ed has referred to, in the seminars, is to encourage organisations to develop their professional skills in investigation, because that's where 90% of investigation needs to take place. And that's where real value can be gained.
And another question from Anthony, with all the different cultures, should we go back to a general behavioural training like MAD, making a difference? MAD? Yeah,
I mean, behavioural training is difficult, and it's not as though Network Rail have done none. They had quite a focus on behavioural training for COSs in terms of track workers. And that focus was lost when they implemented the changes to Standard 019. And we're really urging Network Rail to focus again. I think it has to be bespoke. I think if it's too generic, it passes people by. I believe that behavioural training has a place, it's important, but it needs to be very focused on what the specific task that people are undertaking. I think if you make it too generic, people don't connect with it. That's my personal view, but I'm not an expert on it. There'll be others out there who have opinions, but I know Network Rail are looking at this. Yes, they're looking at technological solutions for the future, but those technologies will need to be applied by someone, and that needs to be done in a safe manner. And that means we need to keep working on it. It might be difficult, but we need to keep working on it.
Okay. I think just thought to mention one from Tony to say, to be completely fair to HSE, time frame is often a function of the speed of the legal system, and you're operating to, I wouldn't say your own time constraint, because I think you do have some urgency. So Tony's just putting us a bit of balance on that difference between HSE and RAIB, but don't forget HSE are prosecutors rather than the role of the RAIB is probably worth mentioning. So I think we've come to just going back through to make, oh no, I've just got another minute, so I'll use this to look at some other questions. James, how does this translate and then influence to the front line? The management carries the can. The business invests heavily, but most people on the front line have an opinion that it doesn't translate much. If any of them, I guess, the question needs to be assessing frontline staff participation.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is what went wrong with the changes to 019 standard, and is that really there was some very good stuff in Network Rail's thinking on moving on developing, if you like, moving from PDSW into 019 standard and revising that standard. It's a good thinking, but in essence, what went wrong is it didn't embed in the maintenance organisation. Within infrastructure, major projects, infrastructure projects, it seemed to have embedded very well because of the nature of the work. But I think there was a difference when it came to the maintenance organisation. It didn't embed. So you're right, that this really has to be a focus. How do you embed these things at a working level, make it real and relevant, whilst not making people at working level feel like they're being held ultimately accountable? Ultimate accountability must sit with the management team.
Thank you, Simon. We've just come to running out of time now, but I've had a few questions about would the slides be available if we could provide them.
Yes.
That's great. Simon, that's been probably the best attended, the most questions, and clearly of vast interest. And I think you may find your next accident workshop fully booked. Thank you very much.
I hope so. I encourage you to all come because it's free.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you to everyone. And you may have seen the message at the bottom about this afternoon we'll be looking at Ladbroke Grove and hearing from Greg Morse. And I hope you can join us for that one then. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you or hearing from you this afternoon.